Hello and welcome back to Off the Record on Tudor's Dynasty and Beyond. I'm Rebecca Larson.
And I'm Amy McElroy.
And it's Sunday. So you know this is our fun day, right?
It is. And we've got
And
a guest.
yeah, so if you're looking at the video right now, you see we have a guest, but he's not allowed to speak yet. Before we get to our amazing guest, Amy, last week we talked about women behaving badly. And we did that because the week before we did men behaving badly, and it was only fair to look at the women. And I know I looked at some of the comments, but we always like to go through them. What were people saying about that episode?
So we had Julie that said, great episode. Penelope put her mother and grandmother in the corner when it came to scandal. So she's not wrong there with that one. And then we have Joni who said, another great episode, fun way to spend a Sunday. The Alice Arden story was hilarious. Given the various attempts and methods employed to kill her husband and ensure he was dead, are we sure he wasn't a direct ancestor of Rasputin? So, um, Katie said she'd forgotten all about Alice. She was definitely a woman behaving badly. As for Penelope, she'd read about her, but still can't believe she actually named one of her sons Mountjoy.
I love that so much.
And then Douglas said Alice Arden should be on a sitcom. Yeah. And then Dwayne said, such a fun show. I guess the only time everyday people had a record of their life is when they ended up in court. So,
Yeah, it's interesting. So the overall consensus is everybody loved the Alice Arden story.
yes.
And I do have to point this out. I have used the phrase turd in your teeth since the last episode.
Oh, there we go. Maybe we can ask Nathan. Does he know any Tudor insults?
Oh yeah. Okay, so if you're just listening now, first I want to quick introduce Nathen Amin, who is joining Amy and I today on the show. Welcome, Nathan.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And no, I do not know any specific Tudor insults, or none that come to mind at the moment. But they did like to use a lot of scatology. They like to, talk a lot about, well, things I won't mention on the podcast. But anyone who knows anything about Thomas More, simply look up what he was capable of with his potty mouth.
I love Thomas More too. He was a lot funnier, I think, than history has given him credit for.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, absolutely, definitely a character. We can talk all we want about his principles and being willing to die for his principles, but he certainly was not. I mean, he's a saint in the modern Catholic Church, but I don't think we would consider him a saint per se, just based off some of his behavior.
Okay, so today we invited you on because we wanted to do kind of some what if, some questions about Henry VII. And in our eyes, you are the expert on Henry VII. I don't know who else we would have gone to. You've been writing about him for such a long time. What was it? And I kind of want to do like just a quick recap here because it's been a while since you've been on the show. And maybe there are people who have been living under a rock and they don't know who you are. What is it about Henry VII that drew your attention toward him so many years ago?
Well, look, I mean, anyone who does know me will know that I am Welsh. I'm from West Wales. Those who don't know me, you'll pick up very quickly from my accent. I am from West Wales. And lo and behold, so too was Henry VII. Like probably most of your listeners, I got into this subject by reading about Henry VIII, reading about the Six Wives, reading about the dramas that took place at the Tudor court during the 1530s. But truth be told, that wasn't that interesting to me. What was interesting to me was this brief mention at the beginning of every book about the Tudors that there was this Welsh-born king, self-made king, who won the crown in battle and who is from where I'm from, who is from where I've got family links to this day. So I wanted to learn more about this man, Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII. The difficulty was back in 2008, 2009, nobody was doing any work on Henry VII. He certainly was not as popular a topic as his son or as the man who came before him, Richard III. So if you wanted to learn about Henry the Seventh, you have to be doing your own research. And what we can say is that this is essentially a brief hobby that's gone out of control. Unfortunately, Henry VII is now the cool Tudor. He's the Tudor who everybody wants to study. So what can I say? I got there first.
I do feel like he has become a lot more interesting to those people like myself who are interested in the Tudors over the years. And I think you have to take credit for some of that because having people look at him again, putting the spotlight and focus on him and showing us who the real Henry VII was, because most of the time we just hear all of the typical things, right? He was a miser, or I guess that's probably the biggest one that I think of when I think of Henry VII. What do you think is the most common misconception? Is there one other than him being a miser?
Well, I mean, whether it's a miser or whether it's been a boring dull accountant king, they kind of are the same. Henry Tudor has struggled with his reputation over the centuries, over the years, and it's all founded, as often is the case when we study historical figures in more depth, in nonsense, in myth. Let's take the miser thing. Henry VII was one of the greediest kings England ever had. The term we need to use for Henry is avaricious. He was greedy. He was an avaricious king. He looked to do whatever he could to fill his coffers with treasure. And there are very good political reasons to do so. And one could argue, in the interest of personal but also national security, it was a very clever strategy that he did. He looked to embolden himself through money. He looked to weaken his rivals and would-be rivals by taking potential funds for treason away from them. And he set himself up not through fear, but through being rich. So Henry VII most certainly was a greedy king. But a miser is somebody who is like Ebenezer Scrooge. A miser is somebody who covets money for its own purpose and then does not spend it. Henry VII is one of the greatest spending kings England ever had. He brought in more money than other kings, but he spent more money than other kings. Now, granted, the things he spent money on were also designed for this overall political purpose he had of security and to project his grandness as a usurper. So we see things like Richmond Palace. We see the Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey, these grand building projects that are designed to make the Tudors look not like the usurpers they were, but as a grand, mighty dynasty. We have his account books. We know that he spent money lavishly. He spent money every single day on great figures, on things like jewels, furs, gowns for his wife, instruments for his children. He loved to spend money on Welsh mead. He loved to reward people in his employ. So Henry was not a miser. We categorically need to stop using the term miser when it comes to Henry VII. It should be fully discredited by now. The problem Henry has is that the first biographer he had, apart from his own biographers, was somebody called Francis Bacon, who wrote in the 17th century. And he kind of invented a lot of things. He invented things like Henry had a monkey who ripped up his account books. I think he invented that Henry hanged a dog. He invented the concept that Henry presided over a very dark reign as a miser. And the Victorians picked up on this. But for the Victorians, they respected Henry VII when they wrote their own accounts. But they respected his administrative policies. They respected his financial policies. They didn't care about his character. So they kind of took all the colour out of his reign and focused just on what, quite frankly, is the boring aspect of his reign. And that's what's come down to us because the Victorians are hugely influential on how we tell our story. As I hope to have shown through my work, there's a lot more colour and vibrancy that is at the court of Henry VII. So, we can look at the character now, not just the policies.
Yeah, I appreciate that part of your work. There's too many of those characters, historical figures in history who are just pigeonholed into one name or another, and I appreciate the work that you've been doing with Henry. Amy, do you want to go in and Nathan, we do a lot of what ifs on this show, so be prepared because we thought you were the perfect person to answer what if questions on Henry VII. So have fun with this. Amy, do you want to start with the first question, maybe about Jasper that we talked about?
Yes. So what I was thinking is, what do you think would have happened to a young Henry if he hadn't have gone into exile with Jasper?
Very simply, he would have been killed. If Henry Tudor as a boy does not leave Wales behind or England behind as a child, he will be deemed a threat because of the slim Lancastrian blood in his veins, and therefore he would be wiped out. The House of York were eliminating their enemies during this period in time, the 1470s. One Venetian ambassador said that they were crushing the root of their rivals. So the House of York were looking to uproot all Lancastrians and eliminate them to prevent dynastic war from coming back. So Henry VII, Henry Tudor as a boy, would have fallen trap of that. We would not be hearing about the Tudors today.
Hmm. Uh, I'm curious, do you think anything, now that you've answered that question, do you think anything would have been different about maybe English history in general if Edmund Tudor had lived?
Um, if Edmund Tudor would have lived, it would have made the Wars of the Roses far more interesting because we would have had yet another powerhouse involved in this dynastic struggle. Um, if he exists through 1456, which is when he died, I think it wouldn't have been that long before he too would have been killed in one of the battles because this is a period when all of the rivals are meeting in battles and they are being eliminated one by one. Jasper Tudor is in many ways the great survivor. That's because he ran away. He stayed away and he stayed out of much of the later period. He didn't try and get too involved. So Edmund Tudor, he would have lived on. He would have been a significant threat to the House of York. I think that's actually why he was killed. I don't pay much notice to people who say that Edmund Tudor died of the plague. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. I think circumstantial evidence, when we put into the context of the fact that he was an enemy of the Yorks in Wales, he was captured by the Yorks in Wales, and then he was imprisoned by the Yorks in Wales, and then dies. I think that says a lot about this man being eliminated because this is what happens during a dynastic civil war.
Do you think, going back to a young Henry, do you think they would have just killed him outright, or do you think they'd have kept him hostage and then somehow he magically ends up dead?
Well, I mean, we don't kill children during this period. This is why the later Princes in the Tower is such a contentious issue, because that isn't the norm. He certainly would have been kept cooped up, kept close at hand. And maybe eventually there could be a different outcome for Henry. It could have been a marriage to one of Edward IV's daughters to try and neutralize him. Or some fate could have befallen him. I think of the true heir of the House of Lancaster in the 1470s. After the 1471 Battle of Tewkesbury, Henry VI is killed, his son Prince Edward is killed, their cousins, the Beauforts, are killed. People now think back that that meant that Henry Tudor became the heir of Lancaster, because that's what he would later tell us. That's not actually the case. The heir of Lancaster in the 1470s is a chap called Henry Holland, and he is the Duke of Exeter. He's also Edward IV's brother-in-law, but they do not get on. And coming back on a ship, coming back from France in 1475, Henry Holland, the Duke of Exeter, the senior living Lancastrian heir, we are told by the chronicles he fell overboard and drowned. Come on. He did not fall overboard. He was pushed.
So much
I agree with that.
conspiracy. I love it. Let's shift maybe to the Battle of Bosworth. And this was a question that Amy and I had discussed a little bit before the show was, what if Henry VII had not won the Battle of Bosworth? Would he have tried again?
If Henry VII survives the Battle of Bosworth and flees abroad again, it's possible he would be used again as the figurehead for a campaign by the French. I think we've got to remember, I don't think anyone really expected Henry VII, Henry Tudor, to win the Battle of Bosworth. The reason he was across there in the first place was the French were funding him to keep Richard III preoccupied. The French did not want Richard III to restart the Hundred Years' War. That's why they were eager to send Henry across and create some fuss. Keep the English fighting amongst the English. That's good for French policies. But Henry wins. So that's remarkable in itself. If he had failed, then why wouldn't the French put him back to work? If they can get more numbers, if they can get more support, maybe he could try again. If he's captured, of course, he's immediately executed and killed by Richard III. The problem with historical what ifs is, where do we start and where do we begin? You know, if Henry Tudor survives, but his entire army's wiped out, then who's going to take him back into battle going forward? So there's many interesting what ifs. One I do think is interesting is in 1471, Jasper Tudor takes his 14-year-old nephew Henry into exile. The House of Lancaster is over. They've lost the Battle of Tewkesbury. They've been wiped out. They need to leave. The intention for Jasper was to take Henry to France. And France was where the Tudors had good connections because of Jasper Tudor's mother, Catherine of Valois, a French princess. The Tudors were very closely related to the King of France. In fact, the Tudors had far stronger links to the French crown than they did the English crown. And Jasper had already been in exile in France for much of the previous 10 years. I think the intention was for the Tudors just to become a part of the French court. You know, Les Tudors or something they would have possibly have become. But a storm blows them off course and they end up in Brittany where they spend the next 12 years. So the great what if is, if they had gone to France as they intended, would the Tudors today be a famous French dynasty who had just amalgamated themselves into the French court? Who knows?
I have a really important question for you. As you can tell by my laughter, it's not really important. Was Henry VII a mama's boy?
Right. Obviously, the idea of Henry VII being a mama's boy is some sort of Ricardian attempt to disparage both him and Margaret Beaufort. Henry does seem to have a reasonably close French relationship with his mother once he returns home. We've got to remember, he returns home to England at 28 years old. He left at 14, and for the previous 10 years of his childhood, Margaret was not even his guardian. He barely knew his mother. Margaret does stay close during Henry's reign. She cannot be considered the power behind the throne or some sort of Machiavellian witch who's pulling all of the strings behind her, like certain historical novelists want her. But it begs the question, was Henry VII a mama's boy? Look, in Wales, every boy is what we call a mummy's boy, a mammy's boy, or a mommy's boy in American parlance. What's wrong with that? It's such an odd thing to levy a criticism at him. And dare I say, a lot of these people online who are criticizing Henry for being a mummy's boy tend to be women who are mothers themselves. So what, do they not think that they should, as mothers, want the best for their child? Should a son not be happy that his mother is willing to do whatever it takes for his safety and security? If he was a mummy's boy, then mother and son were privileged, I think, to be able to share that relationship. So have that, you nonsense online activists.
Yeah, I had to ask the question. It just seemed appropriate.
I think Margaret Beaufort's awesome. Um, but do you think all the propaganda against her is just a way to discredit Henry? Because I don't get it. Like when we look at other women in the Tudor period, everyone seems to praise them for, oh, this woman was really outstanding at XYZ, like Elizabeth, education. Do you know what I mean? So Margaret seems to be that one person that people just want to tear down, and I don't understand why.
Well, that's because these people are not truly interested in history. Let me be blunt. They are activists. That's the way I view them now. They have latched onto a cause and they are willing to do whatever it takes for their cause to win. That's not something that is solely restricted history. That's politics, that's sport, that's everything in the age we live in now that people just pick up a cause and they're all in and they want to convert you. That's the difference. They don't want to debate with you. They don't want to discuss you. They want you to see their side. They'll accuse you of being closed-minded when their minds are already closed. They are what they accuse you of. So there's that, first of all, and that leads to things like Margaret Beaufort becoming completely slandered because there's no objectivity, there's no rationale, there's no reasoning with these people because what they see is their hero has had 500 years of being maligned and picked on, and they want to lash out in his defense. Now, was Richard III maligned? Yes, to a point. I think we've got to be careful not to completely overcorrect things and make him out to be a saint. But it's a fact that he has undergone a deep level of being maligned over the centuries. So how does it work if you are somebody who's looking to unmalign somebody, you decide to malign every single other person that is around him? I mean, Margaret Beaufort's not the only person who suffers from these attacks. And Neville, I've seen, has been attacked. Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV, everybody is wrong except Richard in this scenario. And that is when it stops being history. That's when it starts to be activism. And Margaret Beaufort, unfortunately, through sheer misogyny, is at the forefront of that. Because again, what's odd about this is most of this is driven by women today. In an age of female empowerment, most of the people doing this are female writers or female Ricardians who are picking the side of a man from 500 years ago to attack people, the women around him. You can unmalign Richard without doing the same to other people, but that kind of, again, rationale, logic is not coming into it because this is not history that we are discussing. Unfortunately, this kind of negativity, allied with the kind of book sales that some historical fiction writers can produce, creates a perfect storm where Margaret's reputation continues to be more deeply maligned because it's perhaps more appealing and more attractive to imagine this witch figure who's got her hands in all of the conspiracies and ignore the generous and kind things that she did. Yeah, no, it's deeply frustrating to see Margaret Beaufort get completely destroyed. Her reputation, again, in the age we live in, you'd think that Margaret would be actually plucked forward and raised up as an example of female contribution. But there we go.
Yeah. So,
I hadn't
okay.
planned for that question. It was just listening to you speak. I just wondered. Thank you.
You can tell that I'm tired today because that was actually quite a grumpy answer, to be fair.
No, because it made sense though, because I don't get it. She just seems to be the focus of so much hatred, and I don't understand it when we compliment other women from that time for all different things, and yet Margaret's just slandered all the
Well,
time.
in something that's still current today, Margaret suffers because of her looks. In that we have that one image of her, that painting where she looks like quite a severe nun type person, quite late on in her life. We don't have images of her when she was a 23, 24-year-old young woman laughing, celebrating, feasting. We know from the record she loved to gamble. the woman who's supposed to be like a nun. She loved to gamble. She loved to drink. She loved to feast. If we had those type of images of her, maybe people's mentality would change. So she's being judged by a Holbein picture, essentially, from late in life, where she's trying to project herself as being quite a serious person. That's the equivalent of all of us being judged from one single picture for the rest of our life, as opposed to, perhaps a picture we would pick of us in younger age, or, at a wedding, dressed up nice. That is what she is suffering from as well.
This really is an uphill battle, I think, for historians because so many enthusiasts start out with historical fiction. It's where I started, was with historical fiction, and that's what drew me into the Wars of the Roses. And then, of course, you will either read or watch The White Queen or The White Princess. And then if you don't do the research yourself and understand what the real history is, it would be so easy to think what you're seeing or what you're reading is the truth. But those two films in particular, especially The White Princess, let me just, Nathan, have you ever watched The White Princess?
I watched The White Queen. I only seen the clips of The White Princess because, well, I'd had enough of The White Queen, shall we say.
I felt like The White Princess was so unfair to Henry VII. It was so unfair to Margaret Beaufort. And if that's all that you know is what you're seeing on screen, well, then yes, that's going to be your impression of both of them, that Henry VII was a terrible person. He did terrible things to Elizabeth of York, and Margaret Beaufort killed Jasper Tudor.
Yeah, so let's be clear. Historical fiction has a place because there's not a single historian in the world who's ever come into history not through fiction of some kind. Whether it's a book, whether it's a play, whether it's a podcast, that is the gateway that gets you interested. No one wakes up 8 years old and is reading an academic thesis. They have to be introduced to it somehow. So it's not necessarily a criticism of historical novelists because they're doing what their job is to do. What I do struggle with some of them is the ones who double down on their work, and Philippa Gregory's one is a perfect example. At no point does she simply state that this is a fiction work invented in her mind. She takes the germ of history and she completely unravels it and then doubles down on it. So people believe that she is writing history, not fiction. There's a responsibility there, but there's also a responsibility on each individual person. Come on, take some pride, take some personal responsibility that what you're reading is fiction. And this again comes back to being a society issue. You go on the social media, everybody's right. Everyone's been given an opinion by having social media, and there's no one out there anymore who look inward. Again, that's not history. You try and tell someone on the internet, well, actually, this. No, you're wrong because this person has an opinion, and therefore, who are you to tell their opinion? Okay, well, I now think the sky is black. Do you know what I mean? If someone tells me the sky's blue, it's my opinion. That's where we are going with the historical debate. It's why I have set up my Substack. It's why I'm trying to pivot away from using social media because there's nothing to be gained there anymore for the historian looking to gain knowledge and information in the past. And that's obviously becoming a lot more complex now with the rise of AI as well. So it is getting very hard to try and sift through the weeds to try and present good history. There is interpretation. No one has the facts of history. I don't have the facts about Henry VII. What I'm talking about is an interpretation of Henry VII I've built up and through my debates and through my scholarship and through my research. And it'll never end. I will never be able to end my building up my knowledge of Henry VII. But now people will read a book or watch a TV program and they will go all in on an online war in defense of their absolute supreme knowledge. And how do you begin? Where do you begin counteracting that. We can try this podcast as an example, but are the people, the activists, I call them online, are they going to take the responsibility to listen to this and think maybe there's a little bit more that I need to be reading and studying? At the very beginning, if you want to learn about Margaret Beaufort, you need to have read Nicola Tallis's book, Mike Jones's book, Lauren Johnson's book, my books. That's just a minimum. Then you've got the hundreds of years of cumulative academic theorizing that we build our books off behind it. It's a constant search for knowledge, and it never ends.
Yeah, I agree. Amy?
I can't remember what my next question was now. I've just got cogs turning with social media and how awful I've seen people behave on there. So, yeah.
Yes, yeah. But believe me, I know. I know how
Well,
awful.
yes, you've had it rough recently as well. Yeah, okay. That's fair. I can't remember what my next question was. Can you remember?
Do we want to talk about the marriage to Elizabeth of York, maybe? And I feel like probably the biggest what if is what if there hadn't have been the arrangement for Henry to wed Elizabeth of York? Was there another option for him?
Okay, yeah. So let's discuss the marriage of Henry and Elizabeth, the marriage that made the Tudors. Essentially, everything that Henry VII gained rests on this marriage. What I mean by that is when he's in exile, it's just him and his uncle, and 500 English rebels come across from England to join his court, and that's because they've rebelled against Richard III. They are supporters of Edward V. They believe Richard III has killed the Princess in the Tower, rightly or wrongly, and they leave England because they try to do their own attack on Richard. It fails. They leave. They turn up in Brittany at Henry Tudor's court, and they come up with a new plan. How can we bring Richard down? I know. Henry Tudor, you have Lancaster and royal blood in your veins. You can become our figurehead. But we're not going to support you, you random nobody, unless you marry Elizabeth of York, and that gives us a vested interest in supporting you. Now, that happens. Henry invades, he kills Richard III, and he sets about creating this remarkable bit of heraldic, dynastic propaganda, where he now claims he's the Red Rose of Lancaster. The Red Rose of Lancaster doesn't really exist as a thing, but he now claims I'm the Red Rose of Lancaster. The White Rose of York is a thing, and he merges them together to create this image of unity and reconciliation. And he begins talking about how the previous 30 years have been 30 years of war, nastiness, brutality. And I'm the man, the only man who can solve this by you lot following me and me being the peace bringer to this country. It's not really true because we have the Wars of the Roses, of course. We call them the Wars of the Roses because Henry Tudor essentially invents the idea of it. There was a civil war, but it was not 30 years. It was a matter of weeks in those 30 years. But Henry builds up this almost fear in his subjects' eyes that we could return to constant warfare unless you keep these roses together. So that's the first very important thing to point out. The second important thing to point out is that some people today, because again, to try and build up your hero, you've got to try and destroy the opponent every way, which way you can. And one of the criticisms that's against Henry now gaining currency in certain circles is that he looked to delay or change his mind over his marriage to Elizabeth of York. And this rests on the simple fact that he becomes king in August 1485, but he does not marry Elizabeth until January 1486. How can he be serious about this marriage if it takes him 6 months? Well, for two very good reasons. First and foremost, when Henry becomes king, Elizabeth is illegitimate because Richard III made her illegitimate. So he has to go through the whole parliamentary machine to get Elizabeth's illegitimacy overturned. Because what's the point in marrying someone who's a bastard and whose children will not be allowed to inherit the crown? That's a pretty stupid thing to do. So Henry has Parliament fix that problem. The second problem Henry has is him and Elizabeth are actually actually related. They are both descendants of John of Gaunt. You can't marry your distant cousin unless you get a letter from the Pope saying it's okay to do so. So Henry takes these 5 months to fix these two problems. And in fact, he fixes the second problem on the 14th of January, 1486. The Pope, or rather the Pope's ambassador, says that yes, you two can go ahead and marry. Henry marries Elizabeth in secret 2 days later. He doesn't even wait for the big grand ceremony. So Henry actually marries Elizabeth at the very earliest opportunity he possibly could. Because if he doesn't marry Elizabeth, then what is his message? He's no longer the person bringing unity to England. He's no longer the great, beacon of reconciliation between two warring houses. He's just a Welsh Chancellor. So Henry had to marry Elizabeth. He knew he had to marry Elizabeth, but he needed to marry her for the message and for the support that she brought to his fledgling dynasty. There was never any other question of him marrying somebody else if Elizabeth wasn't available. If Elizabeth had died, for an example, then Henry's got a bit more of a problem on his hands because who does he then marry? Does he marry a daughter of one of his own noblemen? Well, what political opportunism does that bring to him? Does he marry a relation of the French king or the Spanish monarchy? Well, then you're opening yourself up to accusations from within that you are leading almost a foreign invasion, and all the sort of problems begin to unravel. But luckily for Henry and Elizabeth, it worked out. It worked out well because it was a political marriage, but it was one that eventually became a union of great affection, great trust, great fidelity, and it set in motion the growth of England and Britain to where it is today.
I think that Henry and Elizabeth had, like you've just said, a relationship that did turn into an affectionate one. And obviously, we know that Henry mourned her deeply when she died. Do you think there's like a key point when it starts to change from a political relationship into one that is more loving and affectionate? Obviously, I don't mean a single day, but is there a point during those years that it does start to change in the records?
Shall I give you a particular day?
Yeah.
The 23rd of November, 1487, Elizabeth of York's coronation. What happens is Henry married Elizabeth. They have a son pretty quickly, Prince Arthur, and then rebellion happens. And Henry spends much of the next 18 months fending off this Yorkist rebellion known as the Lambert Simnel plot, the Lambert Simnel affair. But he used the message loud and clear. From the outset, there are people trying to kill him and unseat him. He faces an assassination attack when he's in York. So he understands that he needs to do more to appeal to the Yorkists in his support. And for that reason, he has Elizabeth crowned queen in 1487. Again, it's something that he's criticised for. Why didn't he have her crowned quicker? Well, coronations take a while for them to happen. He's facing plots, he's facing rebellions, he's busy. He's a busy guy during this period. And also, quite frankly, there's no massive requirement for him to crown Elizabeth. She was just his queen by virtue of marrying him. She was not a queen in her own right, regardless of how many people looked up to her or how popular she was. But he does have her crowned. So there's very, very good political reasons that he has her crowned. It's to give the Yorkists the day in the sun. And they have a great ceremony. She is crowned by herself. Henry's nowhere to be seen because the shine is on Elizabeth. And apparently this occurred, one chronicler says, to the rejoicing of all true Englishmen hearts. But one chronicle does also mention something that on the morning of her coronation, she sails down the River Thames from Greenwich to the Tower of London, and it's part of this ostentatious river pageant that spans the breadth of the Thames. And when she gets to the Tower of London, remember where her two brothers had gone missing, waiting for her on the pier, on the wharf, is her husband. And the source says that he met her out of, I think, true and sincere affection and pure right love. Again, we can pull apart chronicles all we want for their agenda and for what message they're trying to send us, but we can only work with what we have. And I think that is a very good insight to the fact that already by this point in time, 2 years into their marriage with one child, Henry has begun to trust her. He's begun to see her for who she is and begun to develop true affection for her. Here's something about Henry and Elizabeth. Everybody knows the famous story about how, he has a complete and utter physical and mental collapse after her death in 1503. Unlike other kings of England, Henry and Elizabeth never really seem to spend any time apart. Throughout their whole marriage, they are always together. They're not living in separate palaces. They are together. And when Elizabeth dies, Henry actually abandons the Tower of London, where she died, as his residence. He doesn't go back there again for the remainder of his life. So it most certainly is a union that began as a political match created by two conniving mothers to put them together to create a conspiracy to unseat Richard III. It's not exactly a modern meet cute you would see in a Hollywood romantic comedy today, but that's exactly how it begins. But it turns into trust. Think about this. Henry VII, Henry Tudor's entire life has been on the run. He was removed from his birthplace of Pembroke at 4 years old. He was sold to the enemy of his family, where he lived for the next 10 years. Then he escaped an assassination attempt aged 14 years old and was taken into exile for another 14 years, where he faced more assassination attempts until he becomes King of England at 28 years old. Then he faces another 24 years on the throne, facing down rebellion, threats, conspiracies. Who is he trusting his entire life? He trusts Uncle Jasper. Jasper dies 10 years into his reign. He trusts his mother. He trusts a handful of people he met in exile. He trusts the people who are with him before he becomes king. And then he trusts his wife. She becomes this close bond to him. We don't have private letters. We don't have any, much correspondence between them. But we can see how tight they became. There is one instance that jumps into my hyperactive mind, that in 1492, Henry invades France. He goes over with a massive army, but he very quickly meets the French king and creates a deal. And the deal is Henry would leave France with a lot of money, a lot of bribes, and also with a promise that the French would stop supporting somebody we now remember as Perkin Warbeck. But one of the reasons Henry also gives to wanting to go home is that Elizabeth is writing letters to him saying that she misses him. And he gives this as one of his reasons as well for going back. So as successful a marriage as there has been in English history, and I think it's a point that Henry very famously does not take a mistress during this marriage, during this reign. That is something kings of England have done up until our lifetime. It is not something that Henry VII ever seems to have done.
I love that you brought that up, because this kind of helps me segue to our Catherine Gordon question, because I think it seems obvious to everyone now what a good relationship Henry VII had with Elizabeth of York. When did the idea of Catherine Gordon possibly being a mistress to Henry VII come into the narrative? Was this a contemporary thing, or did it show up later on?
No, I think it was a contemporary thing. I think I'm right in saying it's Polydore Virgil who kind of says something like Henry was quite taken by her beauty. But she clearly was a beautiful woman because Perkin Warbeck, her husband, even writes calling her the brightest ornament in all of Scotland. She was regarded by contemporary sources as being gorgeous. So Henry's a man. I'm sure he would have noticed this beauty. Polydor Virgil makes this very basic comment, but of course, as the centuries go by, suddenly it's Henry's besotted, Henry's obsessed, Henry's in love, Henry hopes to marry her. Things get taken completely out of context. Any historian will tell you we have ideas of what Henry VIII was like, or what he said, or what he did. And when you actually find your way back to the original source, the source is so basic. Henry VIII walked down the road one day. Well, that becomes Henry VIII sauntered down the road. Henry VIII arrogantly jogged down the road. And before you know it, you've built up this entire narrative around him that we all think is true. And he was just walking down the road. And it's similar with almost any historical quote you go back to. Wars of the Roses is very interesting for battle history. Everyone thinks they know how the battles of the Wars of the Roses, how they occurred. The great fights on the fields, the snowstorm at Towton. Nearly none of the sources give us any of this information. They will just say, on this day, a battle took place on the field of Northampton. Richard Grey's side won. That's it. That's the source. The rest of it is obviously us historians doing our interpretive work, using the lay of the land and trying to just put in possibles, maybe, perhaps. And it's similar with Henry VII and Catherine Gordon. There's not much to go on whatsoever to suggest either way.
Thank you, Nathan, for clarifying that. I think that's always one of those conversations that we see floating around that I was hoping you'd be able to debunk it for us. Well, Amy, we're getting close to an hour here, and I'm wondering if we should maybe ask Nathan the question that we posed on an earlier episode. She's looking at me like, what are you even talking about?
Yeah.
What if Henry VII had remarried after Elizabeth of York had died? This is one that Amy and I did together. We looked at some options of maybe who we could have married, but I think this is kind of what instigated the reach out to you, Nathan, was that conversation was, what if he had remarried? What if I don't know. Let's just go with that. What if he had remarried?
I don't think it would have made that much of a difference, to be honest. The reason why I say that is by this point in time, Henry's marriage to Elizabeth has proven fruitful. He's got one son left out of three still standing, Prince Henry, the future Henry VIII, but he has the heir. So sure, if he marries another woman, so what? I mean, Henry, with all due respect to him, is getting on at this time. I'm not sure what his prowess is in fathering future children going forward. If he has more children, and if he has more sons, that could potentially be a complication going down the route. But here's the thing about Henry VII that's very interesting. When he becomes king, he has Parliament declare his right to be king. Essentially, he starts again. He says, I'm the king because I'm the king. What happened before doesn't matter. I'm the king. I'm the great conqueror. And he has the parliamentary record stated that going forward, every single king of England would have to be from his line and none other. He doesn't say his line and Elizabeth's line. He says his line. So I think that's quite interesting because what that means is if Prince Henry dies and Henry VII is married again and has created another lineage, then that boy becomes also the rightful king. But would Henry be able to hold together the political alliance by having a child with a junior line? I don't know. That's to be seen, to be determined, I guess. But aside from that, I just don't think much changes. I think if Elizabeth dies very young into his reign, and perhaps they don't have any children, then that's a whole reign of trying to hold together his supremacy. By 1503, the money's starting to come in. He's suppressed his enemies. There are no more pretenders left. Edward of Warwick has been executed, the last Plantagenet. Henry's in a pretty good state by the 1503, 1504 period. The only thing he needs to do at this point is hold on to get to a point that his son reaches adulthood. Because if Henry VII dies while his son is still a boy, that son is going into the Tower of London, and that son is going to disappear, just like what happened to the princes in the Tower. And Henry VII does hold on against all the odds. He lives for this remarkable period where every year it is believed he's going to die from his chest pains. And he doesn't. He lingers on. And when he does finally die in the year 1509, his son is 17 years old. And he is one of the most impressive, strapping young men there has been. You know, he's a giant of a man. And of course, he becomes Henry VIII. And that is the great triumph of Henry VII's life and reign, is that he lives long enough to hand over the crown to his son in the first uncontested bequeathal of power from father to son as King of England in 87 years. That is the key moment that Henry accomplishes. But if he'd had another troop of children, what would Henry VIII have done to them down the line? I suppose is the crucial point.
Yeah, there would have been a lot of executions.
Yeah.
We got to remember as well. I mean, Henry VIII and Henry VII were blessed in some ways on the Tudor side that there was no sons of Jasper rattling around. There was no sons of, siblings of Henry VIII. Probably more pertinently, if he'd had a couple of brothers as well who shared the same bloodline, who then had sons, talk about a mess.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, Amy, do you have any? Oh, go ahead.
I've got a very quick question, one that you've probably thought of before. But if somebody did a film of the life of Henry VII, who would you cast as him as young Henry, and who would you cast as him as older Henry?
I don't have an answer for you, and I'm not going to be able to find an answer for you for the simple reason I'm not very creative in looking and seeing what others see. I mean, Michael Sheen at the end of the day is just a great Welsh legend, and he can play anyone. So I'd always cast Michael Sheen, whether he ended up being realistic or not. What I find difficult with the Henry VII thing is I don't know if the listeners have ever come across a 1970s BBC program called Shadow of the Tower. And you can actually view it all on YouTube still. And a guy called James Maxwell, an Australian actor, played Henry VII 50 years ago. And he plays him perfectly. He looks like him. He sounds like how I imagine he would sound. But his demeanor, his acting, it is 100% how I imagine a thoughtful, serene, composed Henry VII being, a cerebral assassin almost in considering the world around him before acting. And who could ever live up to that portrayal?
That's a good
Fair
point.
answer.
Yeah. Amy, who would you want?
I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like my mind immediately went to what's his name? Tom Hiddleston? Is that his name? I don't know. I think he kind of has the look of how I would imagine young, handsome Henry, but I also think Tom's hot. So,
Well, what do they describe Henry as being? Tall, slender, but well built and strong. Small blue eyes, teeth blackish and few. So somebody would have to have their teeth knocked out a little bit towards the end. But one thing about Henry VII I will say is that he very clearly had a lot of charisma. We have quite a lot of sources that say that when he spoke, it was as if he was speaking with jewels, as if his mouth is full of jewels. And for all of this dull accountant, kind of miser, kind of stupid, idiotic caricature of him that now is, this man led an army across the sea They had 2 weeks across land in Wales and England to do battle against the King of England and kept his army together. That guy had something about him when it came to delivering a speech and looking people in their eye and getting them to stay on side. So definitely have to be somebody who's got the riz.
Mm.
Nathen, thank you so much for joining us today. And as always, I want to give you an opportunity to kind of talk about what you've been doing and maybe what you have coming up in the future.
Yeah, so I'm still currently not writing any new books at the moment. I'm focusing just on doing a bit more public history when I can. So I'm giving my talks, I'm running my podcast, I'm doing my Substack, and I'm just generally pottering around out there, messing about with the many mediums we now have to tell good history.
Yeah, I love the videos that you do on site. And of course, I love the bloopers too.
Yeah, I'm trying to do more on site, and I've decided that the kind of short form Instagram, TikTok world is not for me. So I'm going to start to try and produce perhaps a bit more longer YouTube type mini documentaries. I find them more interesting to try and just get words out there. I leave all the creative stuff to the kids.
I feel the same way. If people want to support you, what's the name of your podcast? How can they find you on Substack?
Yeah, so I'm currently running the Aspects of History podcast. I'm not the host of every episode, but I do quite a bit where I talk with authors about their work, and my Substack, nathenamin.substack.com. Anything you need to know about me, you'll find on there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nathen, for joining us today.
No problems. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Off the Record on Tudor's Dynasty and Beyond. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're following the podcast. And if you'd like to support the work that goes into researching and creating these episodes, you can find extra content and ways to join the community through Patreon and Substack. And don't forget, you can now comment directly on episodes over on Spotify. I love reading every single one. Until next time, stay curious, and I'll see you back here for more royal drama and real history.